listen to emerging powers. Now let's get to the big boss, the Americans. I mean, Mr. Eizenstat, the question coming to my mind, do the emerging powers politically get on your nerves?
No. My theme is this, that we are genuinely in a historical shift of power unlike that which the world has ever seen. In its rapidity, in its depth, in its comprehensiveness. A shift of economic, and when economic power shifts, political power does as well, from the West to the East and to the South. If the 20th century was the transatlantic and American century, the 21st will almost certainly be the Pacific and Southern century. But what is different is that if one goes back and looks at the emergence of powers over time, the Dutch, then the Spanish, then the British after Trafalgar, the Germans, the Americans, the Soviet Union, their rises were largely uncontested when one beat the other. What we have now is a multiplicity of powers coming to the scene at the same time, creating a uniquely multipolar world and therefore complicating global governance. In the 1970s, when the G7 was first created, the G7 countries had 62% of global GDP. As one went into the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union, that share actually increased to 66%. And this is where the drama comes in and the rapidity. In 1999, hardly 10 years ago, emerging and developing countries had about 35% of global GDP. In 2009, 10 years later, almost 50%. And indeed, in 2009, coming out of the Great Recession, from which developing and emerging countries have come out much faster and much healthier than the mature democracies. Almost 100% of global GDP came from emerging and developing countries. Absolutely unique. In terms of our populations, the West is an aging set of societies. Emerging countries have 30% of the world population today. Within 25 years, that will be 50%. And therefore, they are demanding, and rightly so, a greater role in global governance. But the question is, can we create mechanisms in which this multiplicity of powers who have suddenly come onto the scene can be accommodated in ways that make governance possible? All major challenges that we face, climate change, nuclear proliferation, combating terrorism, economic growth and jobs, all require collective action to solve. But the more players there are, the more difficult it is to have governing structures that create mechanisms to make decisions. We are really at a historic watershed because the question is, will the greater influence that developing countries rightly demand come along with the capacity to create consensus between developed and developing countries? Now, there's one other feature that is very important to recognize in this new era in which we live. It's not just the shift, or as the Vice Minister says, the diffusion of power. It is the integration through globalization of a common fate. We are now tightly integrated as a world economy. Supply chains, and I'm on the UPS board, we deal with supply chains, stretch throughout the world. The iPhone is made in 7 different countries. There is no product of any consequence that is any more an American, a European, a Chinese, an Indian, a Maghreb product. It is a world product. And that degree of commercial integration, which at the multinational corporate sector is highly integrated, highly efficient. There the corporate governance works because it has to work for products to work. The question is, at the political level, can we begin to bring the same degree of efficiency? We are in a very different world than the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. We're not in a world of the U.S. versus China. Indeed, we are mutually dependent in some respects like Siamese twins who are joined at the hip even if we don't want to be. And these newly emerging powers don't want to be any more dominated by China than they do the United States. Let me give you personal examples of where progress has been made in global governance and where challenges still persist. On progress, the World Trade Organization is perhaps the only major international organization with a binding dispute mechanism. And I believe during the Clinton administration, in which I participated in this, China's accession to the WTO and the most favored nation agreement we were able to get through Congress was vitally important to the integration of China in a rules-based system. The U.S. brings cases. Cases are brought against us. We win some. We lose some. Brazil sues us. Small countries can sue us. We can sue China. And we're all bound by those decisions. And they are honored to the T. It's very interesting. You're quite right about sovereignty. We're sort of allergic on the sovereignty issue, and yet, as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, twice participated in a situation where we lost a case to the European Union on our tax code, the argument being that it was an illegal export subsidy. There's nothing more sovereign than your own tax system. And without a murmur, even the most conservative members of Congress twice amended the export subsidy provision so that it was WTO consistent. A second example of inclusion and progress was the move at London under the Bush administration in 2008 from a G7 world to a G20 world. And that wasn't just in name only. It was tested in a deep crisis at Pittsburgh in the early part of the Obama administration, in which the G20 countries came together and agreed that we were near a global meltdown and that we needed simultaneous stimulus packages. And China's stimulus package was vitally important to prevent a global meltdown. So the system met an early test. Another example of progress is the UN Security Council with Iran sanctions. One can argue whether the sanctions are effective or not. That's a different story. There have been 4 rounds of UN sanctions, the most recent being, of course, this year, in which China and Russia agreed, and a vast majority of the overall Security Council and all the permanent members agreed. Now, yes, they were diluted at the instance of China and Russia, but they were nevertheless meaningful. They sent an important signal of the fact that Iran had violated previous UN Security Council resolutions on uranium enrichment. Now, let me conclude by areas where we still have gaps, and major gaps, again, in which I was directly involved. I headed the U.S. delegation to the Kyoto Protocols. Climate change is a global issue. No one country can solve it. At Kyoto, we were faced with a China, India, G77 phalanx like it was the old days, in which the argument was, you in the West created this problem and you solve it. We're just at the beginning of our industrialization stage. You can't ask us to sacrifice. You're the ones that need to sacrifice. We only ask for a reduction in the slope of emissions increases, and that was not acceptable as well. The only thing we came up with, we call it the Clean Development Mechanism, where a company in a developed country can get a credit against its allowance if it does a clean energy project in India or wherever. In Copenhagen, 12 years later, no better. Now, partly that was our fault because we came with the emperor having no clothes, no congressional legislation. The Uruguay round is another example of the need for a consensus rule, which doesn't work. The Doha round has been 9 years in the making. I was in the conclusion of the Uruguay round. There, the U.S. and the EU could go off into a corner, make an agreement, and impose it on the world. That doesn't work anymore. Okay, so we're now inclusive. It's now taken 9 years, and we're still not any closer to a Doha agreement because of the consensus rule. We need also to have rules to prevent forced technology transfers, to make sure that maturing countries and emerging countries don't favor their own national champions in government procurement, to end tied aid in which loans and subsidies can be given to developing countries to tie up their resources.
Can you conclude, sir?
Okay, and I'll conclude in this fashion. We will be facing in Seoul in a month a supreme test of whether this inclusion in the G20 can work on a more difficult issue than what we faced last year with the global recession. And that is, can we avoid a currency war? Can we have a system in which countries play by an accepted set of rules and avoid a bigger-than-neighbor policy which will wreck the global economy? I believe that we can because we are so integrated. So I am positive. I think that we're making enormous progress in a short period of time in incorporating these newly emerging powers that have come so swiftly onto the world scene.
Thank you very much, sir.